we have really dear guest. It's Jonathan DeRoses. He's a long-time committer in Core, and I mean long time, 12 years, just imagine that. He knows it inside out, and he maintains multiple Core components. He was a tech lead for 6.8 release, and he's sponsored by Bluehost in Five for the Future. So let's have a look at how does it work under the hood and what can change, what can happen if you change one line and it affects million people or million installs. So please walk us in. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Test? You get me? Okay. Software can change lives, often in unanticipated ways. This is especially true with open source software. If you attended the keynote this morning by Noel, you saw him illustrate this in remarkable ways through his firsthand experience in Ukraine. Open source can provide a creative outlet. It can empower you to transform your career, access jobs you previously could not. It can give you mentorship, a sense of belonging, help you start a business, or help others. Currently, WordPress is used by 61% of all websites using a known CMS. This is 43.5% of all websites. Businesses, doctors, banks, governments, individuals, nonprofits. Shipping stable and reliable, effective software across an infinite number of use cases is no small task. Making decisions on behalf of every user of the software is both a burden and a privilege. With all this in mind, sometimes committing code to Core can feel like this. But there are decision-making frameworks in place that help us maintaining the software to ensure we're always making the best decisions we can. We should all seek to understand how any piece of software that we rely on is maintained and evaluates change. So let's take a look. To start, let's talk about what a core committer is. A core committer is a trusted person that has been granted write access to the WordPress canonical code base. They're responsible for keeping the project on task in some ways, ensuring the philosophies are followed. They're leaders and mentors for other contributors, and they deeply consider all of the possible ramifications of given changes, even the small ones. Sometimes the smallest ones have the biggest impacts. So in the 22-year history of the project, there have been 110 people who have committed at least once. 89 of those have committed in the last 10 years, and 55 have committed in the last 2 years. 23 of those have maintained a once per commit average volume over the last 24 months. When I talk about this committers in this talk, I'm really only talking about the Subversion repository that has the source code that is bundled and shipped to everyone that runs WordPress. The concept of committing to the Gutenberg plugin, which is also core, is slightly different and has slightly different methodology, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But everything I talk about in this talk applies to everyone in the project, regardless of where they're maintaining code, whether they're maintaining their own code, they should be considering these things, and whether the project is official or not. I also wanted to take a minute to say that committers are not the same thing as a maintainer. While component maintainers is often, being a component maintainer is often a first step towards committership, they're not always the same. It's common for committers to remain as component maintainers after receiving commit, because component maintainers have deep knowledge in specific areas that they feel passionately about. This heavily overlaps with some of the requirements for being offered commit access. There's currently 65 unique component maintainers across 43 components and 20 subcomponents in core. And 37 of those, roughly 57%, have commit access. This is really great to see, and I was actually surprised at how even it was. It's always good to have a healthy balance of committers and non-committers in any specific group in the project. It helps expose people to mentorship and learning opportunities. It exposes them to new knowledge, ways of learning how decisions are made, like I'm going to talk about here. I often think that component maintainership is quite a bit different nowadays as it was maybe 10 years ago. I personally think we need to revisit this concept in the context of how we maintain WordPress today, but that's a different talk for another blog post or WordCamp. So how are the changes to WordPress actually made? There's a few main kinds of changes that are usually made to the project. They're bug fixes, feature requests or enhancements, and tasks. Most of them will start off as a ticket on our bug tracking software, Track. The creation of a ticket in Track I'm really fond of because it focuses on outlining a specific problem and not so much proposing a solution. If any additional details are cleared or any clarifications are needed, the contributors will discuss this in the comments or on Slack or other areas where conversations happen. The solutions can then be created from the results of these discussions and proposed through patches that are attached to the ticket or GitHub pull requests that are linked to the original tickets. After enough testing occurs and a consensus is reached, a final review is performed by a core committer who's interested in Enable. If the proposed changes are deemed valid and necessary and not harmful, they are committed and the ticket can be closed. And that change will be included in the next release of WordPress. Another example of a way that a change can happen in WordPress Core is through feature and enhancement requests. And so sometimes these do start off as tickets, but not always. There's a lot more, many more ways that this can happen. Oftentimes, it's a what-if blog post on a personal website or an officially announced initiative. Sometimes they're community-maintained plugins. The performance team is a good example of this. They have a canonical plugin that's a framework, but then they also have specific plugins that address performance bottlenecks, add support for new technologies, and these are developed on their own schedule outside of the normal WordPress release cycle. Adding support for modern image formats like WebP is an example of this. It started as one of these and eventually was merged into Core and shipped to the world. Another example in that team is the speculation browser API that we shipped in 6.8. We didn't ship the API itself, but rather a sane default configuration that the browser will use to take advantage of this speculation API, which attempts to anticipate where the user will navigate to next and preload that to make their experience much faster. This feature took over 7 months of iteration to refine their approach and address all of the feedback. But once that was done, a ticket was opened on Track, outlining the problems and suggesting that the core may be ready for WordPress Core. After discussion happened, everyone's concerns were addressed, and it was merged and shipped in WordPress 6.8. The block editor uses another unique workflow for merging the source code changes for the block editor into the WordPress canonical repository. Gutenberg serves, in some ways, as a long-running feature plugin. Changes are constantly being made to address bugs and introduce new features, even to try new experiments that maybe eventually are removed. A new version of the plugin is released to over 300,000 active installs every 2 weeks, and much of the code in the editor is in the form of NPM packages. When these updates are released for the plugin, the NPM package updates are published, and when they're ready, Core SVN repository updates the dependency manifest to include these new versions in the bundled software. As you can see, there's no one uniform process for how specific changes and suggestions are made in the project. Good ideas can come from anywhere. Over the project's history, feature ideas have come from both first-time and long-time contributors and every level of experience in between. So process aside, how do we evaluate the quality of these ideas in the context of proposed changes to WordPress? It's important to always evaluate these ideas themselves and never identities of the people proposing them. This ensures that the best ideas will always rise to the top. So while only committers can actually change the code, often they're simply just the final set of eyes. Change can sometimes be driven by project leadership. This was true in the case of the Gutenberg project and Matt setting the vision of a new era of WordPress built around a concept of blocks. But the majority of changes are made to WordPress and are driven by the community itself. Feedback loops with users, developers, plugin and theme authors, consensus building among any affected groups, testing, documentation, prototypes, and experiments. This is a long-standing premise in open source that underscores the value of active engagement in open source. The health of a project improves when decisions are transparent and inclusive. The more viewpoints, the better, and the more well-rounded your software will be. But showing up matters. By participating in discussions, contributing to code, submitting bug reports or feature requests, providing feedback, any individual can influence the decision or the direction of the project. But be aware, with presence comes some responsibility. Showing up, for example, means you need to be prepared. You need to do your research and actively listen. You need to be thoughtful in how you respond and your proposals that you author. In my experience, this premise largely holds true, but there are some practical limits. For example, your presence grants you a voice, but not necessarily a vote. As opposed to decisions being made by those who show up, which is a do-ocracy concept, commit access is meritocratic and is only granted after a consistent track record of valuable high-quality contributions, long-term trust engagement, and earning the respect of your peers. Those with commit access, though, must always remember that not everyone can show up equally. There's time zones, there's language barriers, there's personal responsibilities, and even economic circumstances that will vary wildly from our global project, the people involved. And no one should ever be marginalized by a lack of opportunity to show up. There should be several different ways for them to do so, and we should be listening in all the ways that we can. I mentioned earlier about building consensus, and this is one of the most important jobs that core committers do, and it's often not obvious. Collecting feedback and determining what the best solution actually is for the largest amount of people. But perfect consensus is actually very rare. So rare that when it does occur, it's sometimes very suspicious. What are we actually missing here? For more complex changes, consensus should be clear and explicit, with someone proposing and leading a discussion to reach that consensus. For smaller, uncontroversial ones, it's often implicit. For example, when a committer spots a straightforward bug and they type a one-line fix, two-character change, and they fix it themselves without getting feedback, they're proposing a consensus by making that commit. By fixing this bug, I'm assuming that we all agree this bug should be fixed, and this is probably the right way to do it. Consensus, in some ways, just means that it's an agreement that everyone is willing to live with. If one contradicts a proposed consensus, whether implicit or explicit, then discussion should continue. For those implicit consensus situations, if someone speaks out about an incorrect change for some reason, then discussion can be had at that point, and if necessary, version control allows us to just revert that change simply. Throughout all this, we need to be mindful of that fact that perfect consensus is very rare. But healthy disagreement is expected, and that's actually a sign of care and engagement from your community. This is one of the most valuable qualities that you'll find in effective contributors to open source. It's oftentimes we think differently than other people, and we will not always agree. But even if we don't fully agree, we have to be able to state our objections, but then continue by supporting the consensus publicly and moving forward for the sake of the project. Endlessly rehashing can also contribute to burnout, and it wastes everybody's time, and it's just not a good time. So be able to disagree and commit and move forward. Just as anyone can show up, anyone can create a patch. But that is truly the easy part, even for patches containing thousands of lines. It's much harder to demonstrate a complete understanding of what the root problem actually is, what the motivations are, what alternative solutions you explored in depth. The best ideas are well-scoped and practical, rooted in real user problems, maintainable and testable, and compatible with the project's philosophies. Good rationale is backed with evidence, context, and potential impact. It avoids speculation, and it adheres to the 80-20 philosophy. We always want to ship features that improve the software for the overwhelming majority of our users. Rationale must always go beyond personal preference or novelty. We shouldn't be doing things just because another project did it, or it's a new, shiny, interesting technology. And we should always be asking why rather than why not. So to take a real-world example here, let's talk about the XML sitemap that was added in WordPress 5.5. So as of 5.5, every site now has a WordPress basic sitemap by default. The rationale for this change was that sitemaps use a consistent de facto standard that's supported and embraced by multiple major search engines, which speaks to its maintainability. 4 out of the top 15 plugins on the WordPress directory at the time shipped their own implementation of an XML sitemap. This demonstrated demand. Every site should have an equal opportunity to be evaluated and discovered. This lends to the mission of the project, which is to democratize publishing. It was implemented with sane yet comprehensive defaults. The homepage and all registered post types and taxonomies were included by default. It's automatically referenced in the robots.txt file. It introduced no new user-facing components, but it can be controlled through a pre-existing search engine visibility setting. Site owners can choose to customize it through plugins or themes and add or take things out. And it's enabled for everyone by default. We as a project believe that great software should come with very minimal setup required. This is seen also in our 5-minute install, which may be 6, maybe 4 now. I haven't timed in a while. Many end users of WordPress are also not technically minded. They don't know or care what the XML schema for the sitemap protocol is. These are the users we designed the software for. They are the ones that spend the most time using it. The feature should also just work without a confusing set of options requiring the user to check all the boxes for the content types they want to include in their sitemap. In this scenario, the only way to truly interact with this feature within the dashboard is through a single pre-existing setting that asks the user to make one decision. Should my site be visible to search engines? The code will appropriately handle the rest behind the scenes based on that user's choice. WordPress Core strives to provide a solid array of basic features. And I mentioned the 80-20 rule earlier. But if we're shipping features that a majority of users immediately want to turn off, we've probably made a mistake or implemented them in the wrong way. The WordPress plugin ecosystem is vast, and the remaining 20% of those users can usually still customize their installation to their specific needs. The sitemap feature provides a simple, straightforward API with base functionality. However, it also allows for complex implementations with the use of plugins or themes through WordPress's Hooks API. Excuse me. There's a rule of thumb in internet culture that the number of people who create content on the internet represents approximately 1% of the people actually viewing that content. It's very important to listen to those who show up to provide feedback, request changes. And their voice and opinions, it's important to remember their voices and opinions only represent a small fraction of our mostly silent user base. As a community, we should contemplate how to better engage these users who are not yet vocal. After all, each and every interaction with a user is an opportunity to get a new volunteer. Supporting democratic publishing for all means not limiting the reach of someone's voice just because they don't understand what a sitemap is, what to include in one, how to best accomplish this technically, or have the means to hire someone that does. These are specific philosophies that were applied to this sitemap feature. But what are some others that did not directly apply or factor into this decision? Oftentimes, doing nothing is just the right thing. Not every proposal deserves to be implemented, even when it seems good. This can sometimes be frustrating, especially for people who have a specific feature that they really want implemented, but not everything will fit into the current long-term goals of the project. Poor rationale, lack of clarity, no compelling use cases, stability, backwards compatibility, and stable software is also a feature. So anything that risks that will possibly be said no. But again, that does not mean never. It means come back. We should always outline why we're saying no and what would need to change to be reconsidered. And likewise, sometimes being told no is a blessing in some ways because you can also make a plugin instead. For example, we have the concept of feature or canonical plugins. And there are benefits to this because you're releasing updates and changes to your code is not bound to the core release cycles. You can typically iterate much faster. There are ways to encourage more testing and feedback. And while backwards compatibility is still important, it's not as steadfast a policy in the same way it would be for anything we ship within core. When participating in an open source project, you don't have to respond to everything. It sometimes feels that way, but there are more threads than any of us can ever keep track of by a large factor. Many messages don't even require a response, especially when someone is likely to have said what you would have said anyway. Responses should be motivated by a definite purpose, such as a specific outcome that you're trying to accomplish. However, there can also be costs to inaction, whether that means a change is not committed or a response is not provided. For example, there could be a lack of clarity, or it could seem like the project has stalled in some ways. Postponing necessary fixes can make the problem harder in the future to resolve. You risk losing momentum, and you can also miss sensitive time windows for opportunity. For example, maybe we're trying to add support for the next version of PHP before it gets released. If we wait too long and we're too picky about how we implement certain things, they may not have support for that on day one of that being released. Unless the project is retired or abandoned or archived, the need to continuously make decisions will always be present. The reality is we have to draw a line somewhere at some point. In the case of WordPress Core, this comes in the form of the release cycle and code freezes. One advantage to being disciplined with schedules and timelines is that it can also help reduce the impact of saying no. Saying no is easier when timelines are clear and strictly enforced. The cycles are regular and predictable. It relieves pressure to merge something just because we won't know when we have another chance. But if we follow these schedules and stick to our deadlines, then there will be another opportunity soon. This helps maintainers and committers focus on shipping only what's ready instead of managing unrealistic expectations. There's always, this is ready, let's get this in last minute. And so if we stick to these, it's much easier to say, let's just wait for the next release. But also, when someone cares deeply enough about a feature to invest their time and energy into a proposed change, frustrated, angry, and resentful is separated by a very fine line from encouraged, understanding, and motivated. As maintainers, it should be our highest priority when saying no to communicate clearly and transparently. What factors are considered and how do they contribute to the no? What aspects of the change look reasonable and acceptable? And where is the rationale weak or unclear? Also, you could provide guidance around when they should expect to be reconsidered. The best signal that something should be reconsidered is the presence of new, clarified, or strengthened rationale. Maintainers should always be willing to change their mind as often as necessary, but they should be confident in their conclusions and how they reach them and stand by them. This is also known as strong opinions loosely held. One of the most important parts of any decision-making framework is evaluating cost. But this does not necessarily mean monetary cost. What is the cost to maintain a given feature for a change over time? What complexities does this introduce to users? What is the cost of that friction and how we interact with the software? Will this introduce new problems down the road? There will always be unknown or even unrealized costs, but making sure we document and investigate as many costs that are obvious as possible helps ensure we make sound decisions with the information we have available to us. Time and resources are also not finite, not infinite. Every feature merge is technically a vote against another feature that may have taken its place. The time to review, test, document, support, commit, ship, all of those are subtracting time from something else in some other way. This is known as opportunity cost. A good way to gauge opportunity cost is to start by asking, does this delay other work that is more important? In some situations, a no can be given solely because of an exceptionally high opportunity cost. Perhaps there is a time-sensitive initiative that requires an increased level of focus and resources. Within the project, a good example of this is the time leading up to 5.0 and the initial launch of the block editor. During that time, there was an extraordinarily high opportunity cost associated with anything unrelated to the block editor. It was very important that as many contributors as possible were focused on this objective, so it didn't take 15 years to accomplish. Many changes during this time received a no in large part because of that exceptionally high cost and the amount of resources it would have drawn away from the Gutenberg initiative. Code should always be presumed harmful until justified. Even when one character or line changes, the amount of risk is non-zero. Stability, as I said, is also a feature, and backwards compatibility is a sacred pact with the users of the software that has helped WordPress to grow to over 43% of the web. What are the risks for any regressions? What are the impacts on existing users, plugins, and themes? What is the risk of maintaining this change long term? For example, does more than one person understand what's going on in this change? What if they moved on from the project? How would we document this to avoid that from having a long-term cost and risk? In many cases, our commitment to backward compatibility is a sharp tool in our toolbox for limiting the risk of breaking sites. There's a safe baseline to evaluate against. Will this break something that worked before? It discourages reckless refactoring, encourages incremental changes, and ensures a wide range of real-world coverage. When plugins and themes depend on a past behavior, regressions can usually be caught earlier than and more easily. In some ways, backwards compatibility can also help limit the downstream costs. For example, implementing a change in a backward compatible way can potentially result in fewer support tickets, less documentation churn, and less developer frustration. Does anybody know what this is? Okay, there used to be a series on YouTube from a blender company called Will It Blend, and they would take things like iPads and iPhones and toasters, and they would put them in their blender, and they would say, does it blend? And basically, it was a really good blender. I'll spoil it for you. But there's a similar game that I like to play here when I evaluate changes, and it's Will It Break WordPress.org. So WordPress.org runs the latest commit to WordPress as much as possible. So testing on trunk or the nightly builds is something that you also can do very easily, and you should do. Testing early helps reduce the negative impact of these changes later. It helps you become a part of the solution and not part of the surprise on release day when your plugins and products and sites break with the new release. Spotting problems during early testing can also be a low-friction way to show up. You can have positive influence over the quality of the next version of the WordPress software. There's also a second, more fun version of this game that we play as well. Will It Break Matt's site? So this is a badge of honor in some ways because you've likely discovered something that's very old or not well known in the code base. But this example speaks to WordPress being used in tons and tons of different ways. For example, maybe there's a browser that's running WordPress within your refrigerator, or you have a Raspberry Pi that's running WordPress to control your lights. We can't possibly predict every way that WordPress is being used in the wild. But despite these use cases being obscure, the impact of every change should be considered for as many use cases as possible. When something is committed, that committer is taking on a lot of extra responsibility. In some ways, they now own that change and any resulting test failures, bugs, features, or even security issues that follow it. They must be willing to stand behind that change and until there's new rationale presented that says otherwise. The code you commit is, in a way, a part of you. Sometimes delegating something is also a better course of action than doing it yourself, even though you could do it faster or better. This helps contributors feel that they are recognized and that they are trusted to do certain tasks. It encourages initiative, results in more contributors feeling empowered and taking on more things to help the project. Everyone here can be a steward for our community in some way. These are the foundations and philosophies that have helped WordPress grow to an over 43% market share. But no individual contributor to the project is perfect. We can all stray from these at times. These guiding principles can be interpreted in different ways by different people. But let's all reflect on the decision-making frameworks that we use in our daily lives. Are they clearly defined? Are we following them to the best of our abilities? Are we learning from our mistakes? Can our time and effort have a greater impact? How can we better focus our work around the needs of our users? Are we upholding the 4 core freedoms of the GPL? But most importantly, let's not lose sight of our mission to democratize publishing together, because our community and our software changes lives. Thank you.